Good afternoon, friends and colleagues. Thank you so much for joining us on this, what I hope will be a really fantastic webinar this afternoon. My name is Claire Walker. I am Co-Executive Director of the British Chamber of Commerce, and I'm here to steer you through a fantastic panel and a fantastic debate about net zero, COP26, and what that means for business. First of all, a little introduction about the BCC. Our job is to represent the 53 chambers and over 60 overseas chambers that we have in the UK and internationally, and their businesses and their member businesses represent over 75,000 businesses up and down the country, and collectively they employ 6 million individuals that form part of our communities and will be vital in terms of moving forward on net zero. I'm really excited to be doing this particular webinar today because more and more net zero is coming into the lexicon of the conversations that I'm having with member businesses. And it's very exciting to hear that even despite the pandemic and also changes in the way that we trade with the Brexit transition, this is still a really important issue for our small and medium-sized businesses up and down the country. And one of the things that's really struck me, and through some research that we did with our partner Drax, is that businesses are still, despite the pandemic, really committed to making the changes that they need to do because of the overwhelming desire to support that net zero goal. And in particular, some research that we did suggests that over 2/3 of respondents, so 68% of over 1,000 businesses that we talk to, actually think that lockdown restrictions means it's more important to address some of the challenges around net zero, which is really, really welcome, because for many people you might have thought it would have gone on the back burner. But it is fair to say that because of Brexit and because of COVID, some of the focus has shifted away from this really important issue. And we very much hope that as we move towards COP26, that we will be able to really pump up the pressure and also pump up the change from those businesses. I think it's really important to flag that actually chambers across the country are already doing really fantastic work in this space. Some of our chambers, for example, in Glasgow are doing really amazing work around the circular economy. And equally, some of our chambers in overseas are working together with UK chambers and thinking about how they can maximise their impact for COP26. So there's really huge range of initiatives that we have up and down the country. Another example of that is West and North Yorkshire that do Raising the Bar initiative, fantastic opportunity to try and make their companies and their member businesses more aware of the challenges and support them through social impact aims and make sure that they are making the changes that are necessary. So it's a really vibrant agenda, but so much more to do. And I think that's what the guests will be able to bring today as part of the discussion. We have a high caliber panel, I think it's fair to say. I'm going to run through them collectively and individually and then kick off some of the conversations. So we are joined by Will Gardner, who is CEO of Drax. We're Chris Stark from the Climate Change Committee, James Heath, who's Chief Executive of the National Infrastructure Commission, Elliot Whittington, Director of Policy, which is the Prince of Wales Corporate Leaders Group, and last but not least, Claire Perry-O'Neill, Managing Director of Climate Energy World Business Council for Sustainable Development. So absolutely phenomenal backdrop and phenomenal panel that we have today. So I'm going to start off talking to Will, who has been CEO for a number of years of Drax, and before that was CFO of the Drax Group, and really joined the company at a time where they were making some really big transitions, and it'll be really interesting to hear from him how that's gone into the net zero space, and some really exciting innovations as they move to become a very net zero company. So I'm going to start off with you, Will. Can I ask you to tell us about Drax transformation to carbon negative, and also why did Drax decide to do this?
No, thank you, Claire, and thank you for putting together a great panel to go through this this sort of important and sometimes challenging topic of how do we get to net zero, and what is COP26 really going to be all about? And as you said, I'm the CEO of Drax, and I've been the CEO for the last 3 years. And for those of you who don't know, 10 years ago, Drax was the largest polluting power station, I think, in Western Europe. I mean, we produce about 6% of the UK's power. We originally were fueled completely by coal. And over the last 10 years, we've reduced our emissions by about 85% by converting from coal to sustainable biomass, right? And that journey, sort of that first phase, I guess I would say, of our transformation concluded at the end of March, when we actually ran coal for the last time on a commercial basis. So actually, it's, I think, fair to say right now we pretty much have zero emissions from our power generation. So we like to call ourselves the largest decarbonization project in Europe. And you asked the question, why did we do that? And I think sort of a combination of two things. One is we really saw no alternative for ourselves. I mean, if you look up and down the Yorkshire near where we were built right on top of the Selby coal fields, and there's not a whole lot of power stations still running there. I mean, really all of the coal-fired power stations have stopped running. So for us, it was really a key sort of corporate imperative. And it was made possible really by a great combination of our investors sort of wanting to make the investment in some of the new technologies that we were using, but also government framework by the government to enable renewable technologies in the same way that they've enabled offshore wind, which is a great success story for the UK, in the same way they enabled biomass. But let me talk a little bit about the next 6 months and what's happening, our next step in our development. And I announced at COP25 in Madrid the ambition for Drax to become a carbon negative company by 2030. And there are really two parts to that. The first was sort of stopping to use fossil fuels in our power generation, which we've now done. And the second part was to add carbon capture and storage on top of our biomass power generation. Right? And effectively by doing that, we will be sort of taking the CO2 out of the atmosphere and delivering what we like to now call negative emissions or carbon removals. And I think it'll be interesting to talk more about that, because I think that will become a bigger part of the landscape as we move into COP26. Right? But what's exciting here is that the UK government is really sort of accelerating its activity in this area. I mean, they announced about 10 days ago a competition between different industrial clusters in the UK that effectively to say they would like to support sort of two or more of those clusters to actually make sure that the transport and storage infrastructure for CO2 storage is put into place. And that will happen over the course of the summer. They'll also choose priority projects that they want to support to do carbon capture and storage. And I would expect a lot of these sort of announcements to come to fruition around COP26 and make the UK has the potential to be a world leader in this area, and it will create a huge amount of new jobs. And then we think that in the Humber, where we are, doing carbon capture and storage could support as many as 360,000 sort of new green jobs. And so there's a real opportunity as we sort of are coming out of the pandemic, and we want to sort of build back better, that we can use carbon capture and storage as a big part of this. So we're very excited as we head into COP26. A lot of stuff going on, and I look forward to making our ambition of becoming carbon negative a reality over the next 10 years.
Absolutely fascinating, Will. One question that I have, and I'd just like to say to all participants, please do put your questions in the chat. We'll be fielding them throughout the session today, but also trying to make sure that we get your questions answered. Did you have any kind of resistance to that plan that you have outlined, or did you feel like the tipping point had been reached in order to sort of drive forward that plan, both commercially and for energy?
Well, when we were putting the plan in place, I think a lot of support from the UK government, and a lot of support actually if you look at the surveys of what people think about using biomass to generate power in the UK, it's very much a positive one. Now, that being said, there are lots of people who do have questions about biomass and whether it is a good idea to be used as part of the energy transition. And for me, it all rests really on whether or not the forests from which we're getting our fiber are being managed in a sustainable way. Right? So we're committed to making sure that we're only using fiber that's coming from healthily managed forests, where actually we're contributing to sort of more forest growth as opposed to the reverse. So for example, The forests where we source from in the southeast of the U.S. have twice as much carbon in them today. There's twice as many trees or standing carbon than there was 50 years ago, right? So if we monitor this carefully, which we do, all of the things we do are very carefully audited. Ofgem has very careful rules as to how this must be done, and if we are complying with those, I think it does make a very positive contribution to the fight against climate change.
Fantastic. So moving on, and our next speaker, really has got an absolutely fantastic CV, Claire Perry-O'Neill. So Managing Director of the CSD, and you were appointed in September 2020, Claire. And before then, you had a long track record in this space through your work as a Member of Parliament, which you were for 9 years, I believe. And also as a businesswoman. So absolutely phenomenal CV there. I'm going to ask you the really tricky question, Claire. Net zero's got lots of different elements and lots of different sections of it. For a relatively newcomer like myself, could you try and summarise what net zero really is and how businesses could engage with that?
Yes, well, thank you so much, Claire, and a huge congratulations to you and to the BCC and the members for, really engaging so actively with this topic. I guess, let me start by saying that two things about net zero. The first is that a couple of years ago, this was considered to be really, really controversial, actually. Some of us who were around in the various COP processes will remember that, net zero was seen as somehow letting the emitters off the hook. And this is a conversation we can go back to again and again, a view that we shouldn't be aiming for effectively net zero, we should be aiming for absolute zero, where all emissions should be absolutely removed rather than in any way compensated for. The thing about net, and so we tended to use the term Paris aligned, and Paris alignment, people will know, means having a trajectory that means the world is going to warm up by no more than 2 degrees by mid-century, with an aim to work to 1.5 degrees. The challenge for business people is that's quite a hard target to measure against. How do you go to work every day and add up your emissions and say, are they Paris aligned or not? So in a way, net zero became a much cleaner way of articulating how we had to measure and manage this problem. With the help of Chris Stark, who heads our brilliant climate change committee in the UK, who's also joining us, I was the government minister who was able to ask for advice and say, is net zero possible as a government landing zone? And actually the advice originally was, no, it wasn't economically feasible. But then in 2019, the advice was actually it's possible, you can do this. And I was very proud to bring in the legislation that made the UK the first industrialized economy to legislate for net zero by 2050, followed, it's fair to say, by France 24 hours later. But we still got there first and can fly that flag. But I think now what we're seeing is an explosion of corporate ambition to get to net zero. And net zero basically means that you will, if you add up all your greenhouse gas emissions, and we can talk a bit about scope 1, 2, and 3, and there's a big debate. If you add up the ones you think are controllable, that they will, with the actions you take, both in reducing them, but also in removing carbon, it will sum to a net zero position. And we've set mid-century as the landing ground, 2050, for many of those ambitions. But it's pretty radical. And also, if you dig into it a bit, it's really difficult because there are various challenges. So first of all, we know that there is a sort of hierarchy that says you should reduce before you try and remove. And, as Will talked about, that Drax's original transition was to basically come off coal very, very rapidly to substitute a much less polluting fuel, and then to go further and think about how they can then remove those CO2 emissions to an even greater extent. But the reduction part is difficult, and there is this challenge about what are you responsible for. So scope 1 emissions, the emissions from your own activities, scope 2 emissions where you include your energy sources, and then scope 3, which are the kind of value chain emissions from your suppliers or indeed your customers. And the real work at the moment is on defining and measuring those. And WBCSD, which is a organisation that's been around for about 26 years, it represents the world's leading sustainable companies globally, with trillions of revenue and millions of employees represented. We're doing a huge piece of work on how you actually identify and measure and share that Scope 3 emissions data. And by the way, Drax, I'm proud to say, is one of the latest members of WBCSD, showing its global commitment to this. But then it comes on to the next tricky bit, which is the removals piece, because the scientists tell us we should be looking for about 2/3 reduction, 1/3 removal to get to a net zero. And this is fraught with difficulty, and we'll allude to some of this when we talk about biomass. It is the case that I'm old enough to remember when we all thought biomass boilers were a great thing for our own reduction in CO2 emissions. You may remember that too. Somehow biomass picked up a different reputation over the years. But as Will said, nature sequesters carbon in a well-managed way, in a nature positive way. If it's very transparent or well-managed, it's clearly part of that CO2 removals process. And we need to stop arguing. It's become a bit of a battleground, actually, and actually get on with it. And of course, the next phase of this, also as Will mentioned, is carbon capture and storage, that not only should we be removing carbon using the biosphere, but actually putting it back underground, back into the rock cycle from which it came, is the next big area where the UK government is really striding ahead. So I think, net zero is tricky, but it's certainly a heck of a lot easier to manage for than Paris alignment. The real challenge for companies are to understand their particular emissions benchmarks, to set the targets, because we're all being encouraged to set these 2050 targets, but then to make sure that we've got the action plans, the transparency, the governance and the investment profiles to keep delivering, and to be absolutely committed to complete transparency, to reporting progress. It's not enough to set a 2050 target and think we'll leave that for the next generation. We have to be very clear about what the intermediate steps look like, and very proud that WBCSD members, and indeed the corporate world, is very much focused on setting those targets, but also setting those interim plans and steps and making sure the whole organisation is aligned towards them.
Claire, I honestly feel like I've been educated.
Good.
Thank you so much. It was a tour de force, it has to be said, of really complex subject, and I'm really pleased that the questions are starting to come in. So I think we've all seen you and Will trigger off some thoughts. My next question, and I'm going to come to our kind of next two panelists, is around, given this wave of engagement, where do we think that businesses are focusing their energy, and equally, where should they be focusing their energy? So the two guests that I'm going to introduce to answer that really challenging question is, first of all, Chris Stark, and Chris is the CEO of the Climate Change Committee, independent authority on tackling climate change under the UK Climate Act. And you've got a long track record, Chris, I believe, in working within Whitehall to kind of drive through change. I wonder, is it the right thing to do to say you're sort of the independent sage of the net zero world? Or
I don't know if I'm a sage, Claire. I'm not sure I could take that, but anyway, I'm certainly chief wonk when it comes to kind of talking about climate change. So I'm here to offer the numbers and the technical assessment. So
what does the numbers say about where businesses are engaging, and is that the right place?
Oh, it's absolutely the right place. I mean, we've been talking a lot about net zero in terms of the kind of national mission that we have in the UK. It's an international mission as well. Net zero is the point globally when we stop adding to the concentration of greenhouse gases in the atmosphere. That's the thing that's causing climate change. So it's really important globally. It's really important nationally, but it's really important to understand what's going to drive that transition. And it's more than just a set of national targets. It's absolutely about what the corporate community around the world will do to contribute to that. And in fact, that's a more important driver of progress, I suspect, than the things that most governments are planning to do. And you'll be hearing a lot about governments in the run up to COP26 at the end of this year. But we also need to hear a lot about what corporates are doing to contribute to that goal. The reason I say it's important is because the mission here of getting to net zero is by and large about investing. It's about investing in quite a substantially different kind of energy system. It's about investing in the natural world, as Claire has just talked about. It's about investing in a set of things that will change our society, I think, in a profoundly positive way. Most of that investment, though, will not be done by government itself. So it might be guided by the kind of policies that government will set, the kind of regulations they might set, the incentives they might provide. But the investment itself will be done by corporates, and it will be done by individuals. And it's therefore a huge corporate investment challenge. And the plans that the corporate community in this country have will be enormously important in whether the UK meets its national target to get to net zero. And it's really, really interesting to look at what's been happening over the last few years. Claire is absolutely right. In the last sort of 2 or 3 years, we've seen net zero kind of come into the public consciousness in a way that it just didn't before. And that's wonderful. I really do think that's progress. There is a broader understanding now about the importance of net zero. I think there's probably less of an understanding about how we can reach it. And you can see that, I think, in the corporate commitments as well. We've done some work in my institution, in the Climate Change Committee, on obviously the national work, but also on corporate commitments too. And what we find is that in the biggest companies, if you look at the FTSE 150, for example, FTSE 100, for example, you'll find that almost all of them have some sort of plan to measure emissions and to cut them. But it's at a level beneath that, which of course is the vast majority of corporates across the UK. You find less of a focus on it, more of an interest, therefore, in raising the awareness of what those corporates can do. And I think there is so much that can be done in this space. It's quite exciting to think about how much more progress we could make if this was a broader discussion.
Thank you so much, Chris. And so the next, Elliot, if I could ask you to sort of maybe address that same question. Elliot Whittington is director of the Cambridge Institute for Sustainable Leadership. And as part of that, he also works for the Prince of Wales Corporate Leaders Trust. So doing lots of work with leaders of businesses, I'm assuming, and having those discussions, as Chris talked about the importance of this issue. Could you give us some flavour as where you feel the leaders are going? And we've heard from Chris about the large businesses, but you must work with businesses of all size.
Yes, sure, absolutely. So, I mean, I work with the Corporate Leaders Group, which actually is a lot of the larger businesses. So it's companies like Tesco and Anglian and EDF and Scottish Power. And as Chris has set out, and as Claire has set out so clearly, you know, there's been a huge amount of engagement at that level. The Corporate Leaders Group, we kind of supported net zero for 5 or 6 years, and we've been kind of working to kind of advocate that and make that case to government about that being a good frame. So there's good, strong track record of business leadership and of UK business leadership. I think those companies with the foresight to see the direction of travel, to understand some of this stuff, have invested and have very clearly committed to the fact that this is where we need to go. But there is a lot more to happen. I think Chris is exactly right to point to the fact that there is more to be done at the smaller business level. And we also need to get really into the different sectors, and I think some sectors find it harder than others. Where I work at the Cambridge Institute for Sustainability Leadership, we've also been able to kind of, we do a lot of business education around this. We created a framework around net zero to help companies make that choice. But it's also worth saying, you know, this is an area where more and more companies are buying into this. And that's one of the reasons why around the COP26 process, there's been this new campaign that the UK government has developed with the UN, the Race to Zero campaign. Which is a good way of sort of, if you want to see a snapshot of the rising tide of business ambition, you can look at the growing number of companies that are joining and supporting that. And that's something where you can join and support it through as a bigger company. If you want to join up to something like the business ambition for 1.5 commitment, there's a good route in there. But there's also, you know, routes in for smaller businesses. There's an SME climate campaign that the UK government has initiated that provides a good route in for smaller companies. So I think that there is this kind of huge rising tide of business action. There is a lot more resources out there, whether from Cambridge University or other places. I know that we're working together with other business groups, including CBI, the Aldersgate Group, and others, and increasingly finding, you know, more and more resources, more and more materials that we're kind of creating to help smooth the business pathway to take those kind of actions. But ultimately, the how will matter, and we will need to kind of look at the pathway, and that's where, you know, it's got to be a case of business working together with government. Those kind of rules, those incentives and regulations that Chris mentioned are going to be really important, because what we'll need to see is if you're going to see the kind of level of investment and transformation at the speed that we need to see it, you need to have that kind of clear plan from government. And that's where there's been a lot of progress recently, but I think we're also waiting for things like the net zero strategy to come forward to really set the tone across the economy.
Thank you, Elliot. And actually, you've managed to segue perfectly for me to introduce our last guest, last but not least, James Heath, who is the Chief Executive of the National Infrastructure Commission, independent body to make big decisions on infrastructure on behalf of the government, or to certainly give recommendations. Welcome, James. Sorry that you're last. A great question from Comte on the chat is that, do you think that the government's energy policy, particularly around electricity, is clear? And if so, how quickly will they be able to enact it? And if not, what will be the damage in the short term? So welcome. Difficult question to kick you off, James, but thoughts on that, and then maybe I can come to the broader panel.
Thanks, Claire. I'll sort of come to that specific point, but perhaps just try and sort of frame it a little bit, if I may. So, look, without repeating what lots of people have said, I think that clearly the UK is in a sort of strong position for the reasons that I think Claire and Chris have set out. There's a big opportunity here. We've sort of proved that decarbonisation is sort of consistent with economic growth. I think the question now is, how can we go further, and can we use the transition to sort of lower carbon economy as a sort of lever of both economic recovery, but also industrial strategy and regeneration in areas like the Humber. And I think Chris has mentioned, to do that, you're going to need a wall of investment to come in, and you're going to need early action. And although that investment is going to be obviously led by government, a large amount of it is going to be from private companies, which ultimately means end user businesses and end user consumers. And that sort of wall of investment will depend on policy commitments and plans that give long-term confidence to investors, because projects are going to have to be investable, or businesses won't want to invest, which I think gets onto sort of, I think, the areas that the question was sort of touching on, which I think are probably the slightly less positive and challenging parts. And there's two here. That we've had very sort of ambitious goals from government across renewables, nuclear, hydrogen, heat, electric vehicles. I think the critical part now is those goals to be underpinned by specific policy levers and actually delivery plans with clear milestones, so that we can sort of track progress on a sort of regular basis. And we're sort of not there yet in most of those areas. And I think the other point is that actually on electricity, and power, that's clearly been the sort of first part of decarbonisation, if you like. There's been a significant shift from coal to renewables, and that's driven a lot of the sort of positive news on emissions. But arguably, I mean, it's not easy, but it's probably the easiest part, because the public and businesses haven't really noticed the transition away from coal-fired power, decarbonisation power. And the sort of process has been largely centrally coordinated and planned, with a relatively small number of actors. And when you're going to get to the really, really hard parts, these are going to be the parts that actually impact on people's lives, in terms of how we heat our homes, how we travel, what we buy, what we eat. And there's some quite significant questions there. So I think clearly on electricity and power, as an immediate challenge to go further and faster, because the sixth carbon budget effectively wants us to get to decarbonised power by 2035, but at the same time we've got the challenge of doubling electricity capacity as well, so we can electrify large parts of our economy, like sort of cars and trains and sort of some buildings. So I think it's progressing effectively, I think, on electricity and power, but there's still quite a bit more to do. But actually, some of the other challenges where we're quite naturally further behind, for me, are going to be some of the harder ones, and the biggest by far for me is the transition to heat. But I'll stop there.
That's really fantastic. And actually, James, you also managed to answer Mike's question in the chat, which was very much around, the plans for electrification and transport. So thank you for that. Two birds, one stone. Will, did you have any thoughts around, is it clear, our electricity strategy going forward, and how does that link to net zero?
I think the strategy, well, I will try to answer that briefly, but then Claire, maybe I'll go after these carbon cluster competition questions. I sort of think they're right down my alley, if I may.
Go for it.
I think on the electricity strategy, I think there's a good roadmap that we've got moving. Now, whether it gets us far enough, I'm going to leave sort of maybe to Chris or James have the sort of details of, the time scales are short, the ambition is high, the number of gigawatts of new wind you need every year is huge. I'm sure there's lots of challenges there, but I think being fundamentally an optimist, I think the UK has a fabulous story to tell. I mean, we've basically enabled offshore wind as a global technology. The cost has come way down. I mean, I think to this point, the cost of that hasn't really been noticed nearly as much by the British consumer as you might expect, right? I mean, if you ask people how that's been paid for, the man on the street probably doesn't know that 40% of his energy bill is actually going to pay for that, right? And actually, that's how it's all happened. I think in a way, you can argue whether that's good or bad that people maybe don't know that, but that I think has been a big driver for the success, right? So, and I think the next steps of this, I mean, all the things we talked about will be difficult, but I do think there's progress. We talked very specifically about carbon capture and storage. There's really two things that the government needs to make happen, right? One is they need to have a regulatory framework, or sort of be more direct, sort of subsidy regime that supports it, right? Because no one's going to do carbon capture and storage, unless there's an economic incentive to do it. And the government's been working on the business models for that for the last couple of years, and those are very close to being ready to sort of bring to the light of day, right? So there's a business model for how industrial emitters, a steel plant, for example, how they will get paid by the government or by consumers ultimately to capture CO2. So that's getting close to coming to fruition, right? And the other thing that's for both industrial emitters, that's for using gas with CCS to generate power, and it's also for BECCS, what we're doing for negative emissions, right? The second piece of it is actually getting the infrastructure in the ground, right? I'd be very interested in others' thoughts on this, but the sort of so-called cluster competition, and this is where I'll answer the question. There are 4 or 5 carbon or industrial clusters that have formed. There's one in Scotland, one in Wales, one around Manchester, and then 2 on the northeast coast of the UK. And they've effectively are now competing to be the 2 priority clusters that the government wants to put forward and actually support in a decision that I would expect they will make just before COP26, right? And huge opportunity for the UK. To answer the specific question, I think the Humber is very well positioned. I think Humber and Teesside joining forces makes a lot of sense, right? And actually, once we have these clusters sort of supported by the government, then actually the infrastructure will get built so that actually when people capture the CO2, there will be a pipeline that will actually be able to transport it out into the North Sea and store it underground. And that's a massive infrastructure program that needs to happen. And I think the building blocks are in place, and I would expect it to happen. And we will have carbon being captured and stored by 2027 would be my expectation.
That's absolutely fantastic. Just to close off that lecture, was there anyone who wanted else to come in on those particular issues? And then I'm going to ask Claire to do one of her fantastic explainers about COP. So just colleagues, anyone?
Claire, I could say something about the power, the electricity question. I mean, the first thing to say on it is that decarbonising the electricity system is hugely important, because we expect that there'll be lots of new electrified technologies that will then hang off that the zero carbon electricity system that we need to create. And that's a really positive part of the UK story so far. So we've cut emissions by over 40% since 1990 in this country, which is by far the best record in the G20. And that's mainly come because we've been so good at decarbonising our power system. So we've done that by closing coal-fired power plants, moving on to renewables, a bit of gas in there too. We've got to finish that job. And we have broadly got the kind of strategy in place now that will do that, I think. So it's important to say that there's a lot to do there. There's a lot of investment, particularly in that sector. And we're looking for a lot of investment in sectors like offshore wind especially. But we have got a kind of sense now of what needs to be done. And there's a broad consensus about the changes that lie ahead there. So we'll have a bit of nuclear in the mix. We'll have a lot of renewables in the mix. We estimate that 80% of the electricity that we'll have in 2050 will come from renewables, most of that offshore wind. And then we'll have a bit of something alongside that to complement the renewables mix so that we can turn things on and off when we need it to generate electricity without causing the emissions. Range of options there too. But broadly, we've got that kind of plan in place. The big challenge actually is, I think, the two things are the size of the investment, the size of the change is that we need to double at least the size of the whole electricity system, which is a big challenge. We've got to do it quickly. And then we've got to use that electricity in a different sort of way. And that's, for me, the most important of the challenges. So we need to use the electricity when the wind blows, because we know it'll be cheap. And that we can build a kind of electricity system that does that if we have lots of things like smart charging of electric cars, like heating our homes with something called a heat pump, which allows us to kind of flex the point when that heat pump might start heating the home. That works very, very well with that kind of flexible profile of supply of electricity that we'll have in the future. So it's that's the big challenge, I think, overall. But I think we kind of broadly know what we need to do there. There's a set of other challenges I think are much more, much more open. We haven't yet got the solution outside of the power sector.
And really interesting. I think there's that real challenge, but I also think, Will, you actually made me feel differently about my electricity bill. So thank you for that. I feel like I've helped build something. I think there's a really interesting debate about how companies and people would feel about building that. Claire, I'm coming to you. COP is coming.
Yes.
It's very exciting. Some businesses have heard of it. Lots of businesses haven't. What is it? How can they get engaged? And what do you expect? I mean, just small questions.
So COP stands for Conference of the Parties, which is basically all the people that originally signed up the UN's framework agreement on climate change. Back in 1992-3, I think it was, Angela Merkel was the first COP president. And honestly speaking, I went to multiple COPs as the minister, and also served briefly as the president of the Glasgow COP, which is coming up, without actually knowing what it was all about. So what COP is fundamentally is a group of country government negotiators negotiating very, very hard on a very narrow series of things, well, very big in scope, but actually a very narrow text. It produces a text, and many of us will have heard of the Paris Agreement, which was the high point of a quarter century of diplomacy, where actually all of those signatories agreed that we should work together to hold our temperatures rise to 2 degrees or less. Since then, successive COPs have been in implementation mode, putting a rule book together that basically shows how governments can display that they are adhering to these Paris guidelines. Plus, there's a big negotiation on finance, because of course a big push for money to flow from developed to developing countries, and a whole series of conversations about whether funding should be for mitigation, carbon reduction and removal, or for adaptation, actually helping countries with the problem. And memorably, some of the small island states, places like the Maldives, held a cabinet meeting underwater in a perspex box to demonstrate that while we talk about this climate change thing as a futuristic issue, it's actually happening and destroying ecosystems and worlds as we speak. COP is, and of course last year's was delayed, COP is a sort of tsunami of ambition and action, because at the core of it, the negotiations can feel very dry and technical and removed from, the 500,000 protesters who are outside, and that is actually true. But it also serves as an incredible kind of proof point and high point for companies, for countries, for cities, for states, for individuals to bring forward this great sense of ambition and commitment to action. And I think, as Chris or Elliot mentioned, we have some great kind of a race to zero places where the corporate world can actually sign up to be part of this big moment. So you have to think of COP as an onion with the core negotiations, then all these different layers on top. Will it happen in person? Big question this year. I think the money now is that yes, it will. The UK government will crawl over broken glass to hold the COP in Glasgow, both because this is their big post-Brexit moment in the diplomatic sun, and also, as Chris Stark knows well, this is a unionist thing. We want the whole of the UK to be represented in the fine city of Glasgow. So really important from a political perspective that it happens. And I think the UK government, Alok Sharma, has done a great job actually as president in keeping this diplomatic process going through the year. But what it's not, and I wanted to pick up Claire Hector's point in the Q&A about this, is it's not a full sort of sustainability plan. So increasingly the conversation is not just about greenhouse gas reduction, removal, net zero. It's about what we do to support the natural world. How do we actually become nature positive? How do we deal with the challenges of global inequality? And what we're finding is the most ambitious companies are wanting to talk about that as well as greenhouse gases. And whether it's the WBCSD's Vision 2050 or the Sustainable Markets Initiative, who've just produced their Terra Carta, this is where the smart conversations are going. And we know also that the UK government very commendably is very focused on nature and how do you create a legal framework for natural protection and renewal alongside the greenhouse gas thing. So I think two big things will happen at COP. One is we'll force out a whole series of government pledges, nationally determined contributions, if you like, that I think will add up to 2 degrees or less, and that will be very welcome. But I think we will somehow get nature and the need to protect and restore nature into the COP conversation, even if it's not in the core negotiations, it'll be around the edge. And if I could just make a very final quick point to pick up on this really interesting conversation about energy and infrastructure, which goes back to something Will was saying, you know, place-based decarbonisation is actually where it's at in terms of policy making, and also where I think it should be at. It's really difficult to sit in Whitehall and pull levers and expect things to happen. I'm thinking of things like the heat network project, where we still don't have viable heat networks in many parts of the country. So the government is really pushing for these place-based solutions for climate and nature. And I think they're a great way for businesses to be advocating locally, whether it's through their local chapters, through their LEPs, to basically say, we want to be part of this policy solution. And we can help you, government, because we can come up with a series of proposals that are then can be financed and invested in. And so nature-based solutions and place-based solutions, I think, will play a big part of this year's COP agenda.
Claire, thank you. And an additional gold star for answering one of the questions in the chat as well. So any additional comments from the panel about COP before we talk about what the outcomes might be for governments, sort of levers that they can pull post that? Anyone want to come in? Chris?
Yeah, I mean, I could say a bit about the COP. I suppose I should, since I'm here in Glasgow, proud Glaswegian that I am, as Claire Perry-O'Neill knows. And it is. I think it will happen in person. I'm becoming increasingly confident of that, and I think that is important, because it is important that we are able to have these discussions that Claire so elegantly described in Glasgow this year. I think that what I want to say is what the COP isn't. It's not like the Paris Agreement. So those of you who have followed this will know that the Paris moment was a kind of new treaty, and we're not in that kind of discussion. What we'll be doing is trying to get to a point where we're now hoovering up the commitments that will deliver that outcome that was reached in Paris, and that's important. So this is a summit about ambition. It's about on the ground change. It's about delivery. And actually, that is really, really important to the success of the COP this year. So we will see these national commitments come through. Joe Biden held a summit just a few weeks ago, which had this very happy outcome that we're now seeing this gradual increase in the near-term ambition to cut emissions, to the point where we're now, actually, remarkably, we're now talking about that 2 degrees centigrade center threshold coming into view now. So that process will continue right through to Glasgow. What we need alongside that, playing to this audience, is the corporate commitments that go with it, because actually many of those corporate commitments are more important than the national commitments. And those national commitments, the ambition that the national commitments enshrine, will be driven, if they're even harder, if there's confidence that the corporate world is with them. So it's really exciting to think that way. And that means thinking in nuts and bolts sense about cutting emissions, not just from the power sector, which tends to be something that you need governments to really focus on to make happen, but cutting emissions from transport, cutting emissions from buildings, cutting emissions from industry itself. So actually decarbonising these industrial sectors that we have in the UK, pointing the way to other countries that are not making those kind of ambitious statements. So that's what I hope we get from Glasgow at the end of the year. And of course, everything is pointing towards it being a real moment of optimism if we can bring this together in the way that it looks like we will. So I'm quite excited about it.
Well, I'm really hopeful that we managed to meet in person. I did hear that there was very little planning for a kind of virtual event, which maybe suggests potentially what Claire said about the kind of focus of the government to try and get people in person. Can I just give a bit of a sort of small, medium-sized business, I think, people perspective? I think businesses have really, recognise that they need to do this. They recognise that they need to move in this direction of travel. Obviously, we've got some large companies, Drax and Claire's membership, where they talked about the kind of progress they've made. But businesses are also scared. They've had some big transitions in terms of Brexit. They've obviously had that COVID period, which has meant many of them haven't been able to open. So panelists, what do we think is going to come down the path in terms of Whitehall legislation as we try and meet this shared ambition? And what do you think some of the incentives for smaller businesses are to take some of that action? James, Elliot, did you want to come in first, maybe?
Sure. Just to kind of pick up on that. I mean, I think it is right that business know that this is a thing that's coming. One of the things that we've identified is already a huge part of the world is on this journey to net zero. That well over half over 2/3 of the global economy has sort of said, yes, this is the direction we're going. If you add up the corporate commitments and the government commitments, so this is the trend that we're traveling in. And for smaller businesses, it does look scary. It does look kind of confusing because what are the levers that you can pull? But I think probably part of the story of this transition is some parts of it are easier than others. The journey towards transforming power is well underway. That's an area where it's easy as whether as a corporate or an individual consumer. If you're not already, you can talk to your power provider. You can shift power providers and make sure that you're getting 100% zero carbon or renewable energy, and you kind of provide incentives into the system in that way. We're also seeing other bits of the system move, like we're seeing the growth of electromobility, electric cars, so transport is shifting. There are harder bits, and this kind of goes to your part of the question about where are we going to see more government action. So, last year, Boris Johnson made a huge set-piece speech, probably the biggest single ever set-piece speech by a UK Prime Minister around the green economy. But he very clearly pitched it not as we're going to save the world, not as this is how we deal with the climate challenge, although it was about that. He pitched it as his 10-point plan for a green industrial revolution. And I think that's probably one of the big important pieces around this, which is this is not purely about kind of delivering carbon reductions because we have to, although we do have to. But actually, if you look, this is the direction of travel, and we want to be competitive. We want to actually have our businesses be prepared for the kind of economy of the future, the markets of the future. And if they are investing, innovating for a zero carbon economy, they will be better prepared. So part of this is about thinking in whatever sector you are, like if my sector changes, if all of these changes are happening sector by sector, what does that mean? But also we're seeing more government action. We've seen an industrial decarbonisation strategy. We've seen an energy bill white paper. We're going to see, hopefully soon, a heat strategy. We're also going to see other parts of that. So, as Claire has talked about, we're seeing a lot of movement in terms of the environment and regulation around nature. So over the course of last year and this year, we should see more and more action in specific sectors, shifting each of the sectors. And that's where there's got to be kind of key action. You've got to kind of look to the detail of what's happening there. The one last thing I would say is that one of the really critical pieces around this from a business perspective is the way it works with the value chain. So if you're a smaller company, most smaller companies are, or a lot of them, are in the value chain or in the supply chain of bigger companies. And as more and more bigger companies take these commitments, they will want to work with their suppliers. And many of the companies that I work with already do work directly with their suppliers to try and support them and encourage them to transition. And that's going to be a key part of the journey. And I think that, if you think about your market, you think about your customers and what they're going to want. And there's a really good economic logic to that as well, because often if you're, in some sectors, the cost of change is quite hard. If you're right there in the kind of driving seat, the cost of decarbonising a ton of steel, if you're a steel producer, is almost, increasing the cost of that ton of steel by half or doubling it. But if you're selling a car, actually it's only adding like 1% to the cost of the car if you make that car with net zero steel. So the more we can join up these value chains, the more we can have the top of the value chain sending the signal down to support change throughout the economy. That's where we will get a faster and faster journey of change. And that's what we're seeing in other parts of the economy as well.
Thank you so much, Elliot. Claire, you also had your hand up. So
I did. I'm going to say something. Forgive me. I shouldn't say this as a former government minister, but I wanted to sort of perhaps move the conversation away a bit from responding to government regulation with an observation that some of the most impressive companies out there are ones who have done this transformation, not because they've responded, but because they genuinely want to transform. And it's often a sort of a view that they want to be a more sustainable and inclusive company in general. And if you like, a net zero goal becomes part of that ambition. And oddly, the pandemic, I think, given it's thrown up every possible working practice we ever knew in the air and forced companies to rely on different forms of business model, has given us space to think about that. And what I find really exciting is that companies across, globally, large and small, are saying maybe it's time to do things differently. Maybe if we want to be a sustainable capitalistic system for the next 30 years, we do need to rethink our ambitions and our goals and almost, front run government ambition, which is often actually the role of the corporate sector globally. The corporate sector was miles ahead of the negotiators into the Paris Agreement. And the other thing, of course, is in terms of employee retention and recruitment, my kids all want to work for companies, but they want to work for companies who are on the right side of history. And so, we increasingly hear that this is an employment necessity as well. So I guess my plea to the BCC would be to be bold, to, trust the courage of your convictions as leaders and to make those changes. The UK government is going to throw lots of money at this transition. Why? Because, as been said very eloquently, this is part of the Build Back Better, the big green recovery plan, and whatever the UK government's spending is being spent in even greater amounts around the world. So there is a lot of public money that will go into this transition, and I think it's out there for companies. But I think a bit of kind of boldness and leadership conviction about doing this because it's the right thing to do will also be really effective in the next few years.
Yeah, I mean, it's a really great point. And actually, there's a question in the chat, Claire, from Miranda Barker, who is one of the chief executives within the Chamber Network East Lancs, but also co-chairs with Glasgow our climate change group with Chambers, and is a really fantastic force on this. And she's saying, actually, are we going to see government drive some of this change in their own procurement, in the own way that they operate?
Well, it's a great point. I'll make this point and then move on. But I mean, one of the big challenges we've got is what we call decarbonizing the built environment. How the heck do we take carbon out of concrete and steel, which are the two giant industrial sectors we're full of emissions? And some governments around the world, some states in the US and others, have actually made public procurement a requirement, a certain proportion of low carbon building materials, and that really resets the dial. And if there are some things we could advocate for this year, having government spending being bounded by some of these conditions would be a game changer.
And we've seen this with other things as well, Claire, as it's your time as government minister, when there's accountability around pay gap reporting, when there's accountability about BME numbers and equality and diversity, that from big procurement spenders, that is what drives change, and you start seeing it come down the supply chain as well, not just for those larger firms, and actually sometimes when those big companies take action, that you see it as well. Will, you wanted to come in, and then there was a really good question from a small and medium-sized business on the chat. So aware of time, Will. We can't hear you, Will, I'm afraid.
Sorry, and has to be one person who doesn't unmute properly. But one of our businesses, Haven Power, is a major seller of renewable power to businesses large and small. And what we're finding from our customers, one is they all want renewable power, and so that's sort of the first step that people are taking. But the next step they're taking is, can we help them find ways for them directly to reduce their footprint? So that things like, putting solar panels on their buildings, or installing EV electric vehicle charging at their sites, or sort of more ambitious, can we help them manage if they have things that are assets that are big users of power? Can they flex those to respond to demand signals coming from National Grid? Use them when the power is less expensive, and maybe not use it when it's more expensive. So there's a lot of that happening. But the next phase in this, I think, is going to be people starting to actually say, well, how can we help them access carbon removals, right? How can we help them to, whether it's buy, carbon removals, understand which ones are legitimate, which ones are not. How can they participate in those markets as those markets become more real? So again, through power providers, there's a whole lot of other steps that companies can take to participate in this and reduce their own emissions, sort of as Claire's suggesting.
Absolutely. James, from the National Infrastructure Commission point of view, you must see some of the kind of responsibility of spend and how that drives through some of the supply chain issues. Is that something that's discussed on a kind of big scale, or are you seeing that coming through much more?
It is. I mean, I think in all of these areas, the sort of the supply chain is a sort of critical area. I mean, I alluded to it at the start, and it's actually quite a pretty good example of this. That I think I said at the start that probably the sort of single biggest challenge beyond sort of electricity and beyond transport and beyond sort of heavy industry is probably around sort of transition to sort of low carbon heating in sort of buildings, including sort of homes. And it's uniquely hard, I think, for two reasons. One, that virtually everybody will need to do something, which could actually be quite disruptive. And therefore, you're going to have to overcome a lot of inertia among consumers or businesses. You have to get much better information around how you go and buy heat pumps or how you go and buy a hydrogen boiler. And your incentive problems are there as well. So actually, lots of stuff on the demand side, but yeah, lots of these net zero challenges are often talked about as supply side technology problems. Actually, the demand side of the transition to heat, I think, is going to be trickier than all the very complex questions around how you convert gas networks and all the rest of it. If you want to get 20 million gas boilers dealt with on this time frame, and then that sort of brings me to sort of like the supply chain. What's slightly worrying at the moment, I mean, that's slightly provocative here, but the government is struggling to give money away for energy efficiency. There have been a number of problems with schemes where effectively the government's trying to give money away to ask people to do things. And I suspect one of the reasons why it's struggled is there'll be some information problems, but there also wasn't a sort of scaled up supply chain, an effective supply chain to respond to the demand that was there. So it's a sort of, if you like, an example of sort of how you need to scale up the supply chain significantly if you're going to respond to some of these major challenges.
Really, really interesting point. Thank you. We've got one specific question that I think is excellent on the chat. I'm just going to ask Chris if he can answer. I'm putting you on the spot here.
Go on.
So Martin says, we're a small and medium-sized business working on innovation to reduce aviation impact by 1%, worth 2 MT CO2 a year across Europe. It's a multi-stakeholder solution. Who should we be speaking to about stakeholders counting for this as an offset? I thought it was a really good question because it sounds like someone's really trying to do the right thing here.
Yeah, and there's so much interest, isn't there, in the aviation sector generally, and lots of really interesting things happening there. I mean, I would absolutely recommend a chat with the Department for Transport, who I think are really trying to up the ambition generally on aviation. The really interesting thing that's happened in the last few weeks is that we gave the recommendation to the government in December that they had to set this new target for the 2030s, which they've duly done, but also that target for cutting emissions needs to encompass international aviation and shipping emissions for the first time. We've never had that before, and the government's agreed to that. And it's meant that the Department for Transport is now really at the front of the whole battle against climate change and cutting emissions. And one of the toughest challenges is aviation. Now, the DFT are really on it, I think. I mean, the other thing I would say is please do get in touch with us, because we can listen to what you have to say about the particular innovation that you're talking about. Also direct you a bit to the right people in Whitehall. And there's a lot happening. I mean, Grant Shapps has been a bit of a revelation actually in that Secretary of State role, because partly I think because he's a pilot, interestingly enough. So he's a pilot who drives a Tesla, which is kind of perfect really if you want to have a minister who wants to kind of get focused on the challenge. So that's been great. He's got his Jet Zero Council, which wins no awards for the naming of new government initiatives with business, but that's the Jet Zero Council that's looking at how we can cut emissions from aviation.
Chris, I thought you were going to say he's got his own jet, but that was going to be...
He may have. I mean, I don't know. Claire might know, but I don't.
It's got a small plane, I think.
It's got a little twin engine, something or other. But he is. I totally. I think actually the DFT, and of course it's always complicated cross government. But I really commend the DFT for a lot of the work they've done. Not least bringing the railways back into public-private ownership, which bodes well for the future investment plans as well. But no, he's done very well.
I'm not sure always when I speak to DFT they would reflect those views. Anyway, look, it is 2 minutes before close. I just wanted to say, actually, this has been a revelation for me. I've learned absolutely loads, but I also feel like it's the start of the conversation as well. I feel like there was a huge number of participants on the call, and actually I think the questions were really, really fascinating. So can I just thank first of all Will, and thank you for Drax for their support for this event. Chris Stark, thank you particularly. Please do contact us that SME, and we can put you in touch with Chris after his helpful suggestions there. James Heath from the National Infrastructure Commission, Elliot from the Institute of Sustainable Leaders from Cambridge, and last but not least, Claire, I definitely think you have a future role with your own YouTube channel, describing some of these really complex things in a really succinct way. So thank you all. It has been absolutely brilliant, and hopefully we can do some more of these thought leadership events as we run up to COP. So thank you, everyone.